Hi, Jeremy Crow here. In this live stream, I wanted to do a topic on explaining the different major states of consciousness that you encounter as an individual, as an entity, as a sentient being. I tried to do a few videos on this, pre-recorded videos, but they all ended up devolving into sort of rant, barely coherent. So I figured I'd do the same topic, but I'd do it in a live stream instead because it's more of a rant style format anyway. And maybe somebody who's on there watching can participate with me and ask questions or ask for clarifications on different points or add their own points, and maybe it won't be quite so incoherent as the as the previous attempts at pre-recorded videos on this topic were. So for the people that are here already, I want to say thank you for joining me on this impromptu live stream. This is my second main live stream that I've done on this channel. I've done a few live interviews with people on this channel before, but this is my second solo live stream where I actually checked the live chat and answered questions and just had this live back and forth with the audience. So if you have anything that you wanted to add at any point, leave a message in the live chat, and I'll try and get to all the different questions that anybody brings up. If you're watching this as archive later on, feel free to leave a comment to the video as well, and I respond to a huge percentage of the comments that are left on my videos, even the older videos. So that's another way that you can interact with this video, even if you didn't catch the live stream. So the topic that I wanted to cover in this video was the 3 primary states of consciousness. And in particular, the ones that we're the most familiar with, which would be the waking experience and the dreaming experience. So the third one would be kind of a lack of experience, like what we would experience, or it's hard to use dualistic language to describe non-dualistic things, but basically the non-experience of being in a dreamless sleep. So what I mean by non-experience is that when you are having the waking experience, there's an experience. There's this, might as well call it a virtual reality simulation, model of the universe, model of reality that's being presented to your conscious awareness. It's being generated internally, and you are experiencing it because that experience is being presented to your conscious awareness. And now the same thing happens when you're having a dreaming experience, where a fully immersive, three-dimensional virtual reality simulation is being generated by your mind and presented to your conscious awareness. Now, that same function that produces the experience is active when you're awake and when you're dreaming. But when you are in dreamless sleep, it's not functioning. You have all that is stripped away, and you're just left with what some people call the ground of being. This is a kind of an Eastern term. Also, it's sometimes referred to just as awareness. Not necessarily consciousness, but awareness. Without the anchor of experience, most often we lose consciousness. Most often we are not able to consciously have some sort of perception of that state without an experience to anchor our conscious mind to. But through training, you can eventually learn to have that perception of that state without the experience. It's almost like a pure meditative state, you could call it. Now, just to dig into it a little bit more, and if anybody has anything to add, feel free. But I like to think of it kind of like the three principal elements of alchemy. So you have salt, which I would associate with the waking experience. Because it deals a lot with forms and the almost the solidity of things, the blueprint of actually manifesting something. And I would do sulfur, would be the dreaming experience. And this is more of a personal thing in a sense. It's more like a reflection of your own internal stuff, you could say. And then Mercury would be the dreamless state, the dreamless sleep state. And that is like a pure drop of awareness, you could call it. And it feels like it is eternal, timeless, and formless as well. There's no form. You don't feel the sense of a body when you are having a perception of that state. So that is very uncommon thing for people to experience. I mean, it's happens every time you go to sleep and have a dreamless sleep, you know, or the dreamless parts of your sleep, but we aren't used to maintaining any kind of perception of that state. We just swoon. Our consciousness is completely lost and we're gone to it. But there are a few situations where we're kind of in it and we create these kinds of mental I don't know what you want to call it, mental models, I guess, fill in the gaps to try and explain what we are perceiving. And so sometimes what I think happens is sometimes when you have one of these experiences where you fall asleep and then you get this sensation of falling, not a dream that you've tripped over something, because that also happens. Where you've stepped down a hole or you wakes you up. I'm talking about a different situation where instead you just have this sensation of falling, and maybe it's complete darkness, or maybe it's just pure white or pure light or something like that, where there's no real like environment, but you do have this sensation of falling. And what I think that is you are having one of these experiences where the waking experience is not occurring, the dreaming experience is not occurring, that experience generator is not turned on. And because we're used to having this sensation of weight on our body, the weight of gravity, the weight of, you know, the clothes on our body, and the feeling of us being pulled down in a sense, I think that without that, we interpret that sometimes as weightlessness. So that's another thing that people, you know, if you've ever experienced weightlessness, I mean, it's essentially the feeling of falling, right? So I think that when that experience of weight of your own body is not being generated, the mind can perceive that as a weightlessness, which you know, generally think of as a feeling of falling. And so if you can relax into that, you can end up entering into a conscious state of that dreamless state where there is no experience being generated, and you can be in that pure ground of awareness. So I did get a comment here from the light of the darkness, JD. Everybody, it says, good afternoon, Jeremy, and good afternoon, Jeremy, and everyone. Thanks for hopping on and for leaving a comment there. That's JD. Everybody should check out his channel. He's got a great YouTube channel where he does all kinds of live streams as well, a lot more than I do, and some really insightful stuff on there. So everybody who's watching this should check out JD's channel, From the Light of the Darkness. So does anybody have any comments that they wanted to make on that, what I've said so far about the states of consciousness? Definitely feel free. I'll mention it, and we can get a discussion going. But just to follow up, yeah, man, I always enjoy your content so much. Thanks, JD. Appreciate it. Yeah, I really enjoy your channel as well. And Orlee's channel as well. You guys have some really good content on there. So what I was trying to get at was one of the goals, I think, one of the goals of the great work, you could call it, is trying to become aware, or lucid is a good word to use, trying to achieve the ability to have lucidity within all three of those major states. The waking experience, the dreaming experience, and dreamless sleep. And there are practices you can do to achieve this. Now, it may seem ironic, but the most awake or the most lucid you can get easily is usually within the dreaming experience. Because the thing is, when we are having the experience, when the experience generator is functioning, and we're being presented with this virtual reality simulation, we assume that it's a solid waking experience. We assume that we're directly perceiving reality when we're having one of these experiences, but it's not true. Not even when we're awake. So let's break it down. When we are having the waking experience, what happens is that data is being collected from our physical sense organs. So let's say light will enter the eye, and it will trigger only certain frequencies and certain intensities of light, only within a certain narrow range. So light that goes into the eye that's within a certain range of intensities and frequencies will trigger the rods and cones in our retina to fire off an electrochemical signal, which gets sent down the optic nerve into the brain. The brain takes that raw data along with the data from stimulating the nerve endings in your skin, and all of the different data collection points that we have in our physical organism. They collect data, and then they send that raw data to the brain, and then the brain then takes that raw data and it compiles it and presents this virtual reality simulation that is a symbolic representation of reality. And that's what we experience. We're not directly experiencing reality. We're experiencing a map of reality, of one aspect of reality, a very narrow bandwidth of reality that we're experiencing a representation of, a symbolic representation of, that's generated internally based off of data that we've collected. So that's the waking experience. When you have the dreaming experience, mostly it's not sensory data that is being used to generate the hologram, you could call it. I like to call it the hologram. Um, it's just, it's, I've heard it described as pure perception, unfettered by physical sense organs or by the physical sense data. But it's using data that's more internal, presumably, because I know that most of the dreams that you have are generated from recent memories, usually, especially what you did that day. So, one thing you can do is you can do a daily review of what you did in the day and even go backwards through it and recall the main things that you did all day. If you do that before you go to sleep, you're more likely to recognize your dream as a dream and therefore gain lucidity. And if you can stay in the dream once you've gained that lucid awareness of the fact that you're dreaming, then all kinds of possibilities open up to you. And there's different levels of lucidity as well. So, for example, if you are in a nightmare and then you realize, oh, this is just a dream, the most common instinct that people will have when that situation happens is like, oh, it's a dream, I'll just wake myself up. Well, that's not very high level of lucidity, because if you were truly fully lucid, you would realize that it's not necessary to wake up to escape the nightmare, that you have the ability to change the dream if you are lucid, but also that even if you didn't change the dream, that it poses you no threat anyway, so that you don't need to flee the nightmare to escape the monster. And in fact, you don't actually escape the monster, you just avoid it. It's an aspect of yourself that maybe is estranged, a part of yourself that you've rejected, perhaps. Or it might be the representation of a trauma that has encoded itself into your psyche, that you've built up workarounds so that you don't have to touch those sore spots in your mind. I see JD said, do you think that these experiences are actually other lives in other realities? Well, sort of. I feel like it's a different bandwidth of reality, that you are just tuning in to a different set of data when you are in a dream, for example, or when you are having an astral projection, or when you are awake, or when you are having a waking experience but you've got the influence of heavy psychedelic drugs, for example, in your system. These are different ways to change the data set that you are currently focusing on, the data set that the hologram generator is using as inputs. So when we're awake, we are still experiencing an internally generated hologram, but it's focused mainly on representing data collected from our sense organs. There is some element that's not that. You know, our brain fills in a lot, especially based off of expectation. And memory, like I said, memory is a huge aspect of our experience in life. And it colors our waking perception massively. But still, that hologram generator is still mainly focused on giving you a representation of your sense data organ, or sense organ data. And the dreaming experience, or an astral experience, you could say, in general, because I feel like dreaming is kind of like the general term, the generic term that I use for like an astral experience, or you could say a subtle experience. You are still having an internally generated experience, an internally generated hologram, you could say, but it's using a different, it's focusing on a different set of data. Now, there may be data coming in from external, but it's not coming in through the physical sense organs. That's a possibility too. So you have here the idea that of like telepathy or shared dreams or even tapping into some sort of collective unconscious. Miss B, hi. Hi, Miss B. Thanks for tuning in to my live stream. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to pop them in the chat. So yeah, in a way, I do feel like they are other realities, but I feel like it's just part of the same continuum of reality, and we're just focusing in on different aspects of it, different bandwidths of reality. Some people say that our brain is like an antenna, and that it can both transmit subtle, energy, you could call it, I suppose, that has data encoded in it, and that we can receive data through this antenna of the brain or of the mind or of the nervous system in general is probably more likely. That there is a form of bioelectric energy that we have, but there may be other types of subtle energy as well that science maybe doesn't fully understand, and that our entire nervous system can be tuned to both transmit and receive this subtle energy. And that some people believe that that is the source of consciousness, that that is actually the conscious awareness, you could say, the point of conscious awareness, that once everything else is stripped away, that's all that's there. Now, this is an idea that you might find interesting. So let's take those three states again. So let's say the pure ground of being, Mercury, let's call it. That, let's say, is a mathematical point of light, you could call it. And it has no form, it's formless, and it's eternal. It's just a mathematical point. There is no actual density to it. It's just one-pointedness. It's a monad, in a sense. Now, let's say that that's your deepest, truest self. And then everything else grows up around that, let's say. So let's say that's one dimension. Now let's say we expand into the second dimension. And now we have this perception of being able to reflect on the self, being able to say this is this and this is not this. You could say this is self and this is other. Even if that's not true, even if everything is self, you can still identify with one aspect of something and reject the other aspect. So there is still that duality, that inherent duality, which is the beginning of manifestation. And then let's say you move into the third dimension. Now we have the ability to not just have a point or a line, or now we have the ability to have like a plane, and we call this the astral plane oftentimes. And this is the world of forms. So it's not bound by time, and it's not bound by the same limitations that we have on the dense physical matter, but it's like pure information. So you can think of it like software in a sense, because you can make multiple copies of software without losing the original copy. So having multiple copies of something doesn't diminish the one thing. And you can chop it. I mean, chopping it into two parts, I mean, it doesn't make as much sense. It doesn't make the same kind of sense. So it's like you can, it behaves under different rules, you can say, compared to the more dense, time limited physical reality, you could say, the astral plane. And that's the world of forms, and that's kind of the third dimension. And then once we get into the fourth dimension, now you have a timeline. You have linear sense of cause and effect. And that's not something that exists in the dream world in the same way. You can jump from one thing to another in the dream world, and there's nothing in between. In the dream world, there could be a table, and there's no carpenter that made the table. There's no tree that grew, that got cut down and turned into a piece of board or a piece of lumber that could get constructed into a table. There's just purely a table with no cause. It's pure effect in a sense. Or you can have reversal of cause and effect. People refer to it as the acausal plane. Now, when you get into the fourth dimension, now you have that linear time, that linear sense of time, where you do have that cause and effect in display. And that is, you're going to have persistence. The one moment is directly related to the moment that preceded it. So those are some limitations of that. So that's the salt level. And then the sulfur level, you have the acausal plane. And then the mercury, you have the pure point of light. So let's see, I got a couple comments here that I missed. Okay. Adversarial Self said, "Hi Jeremy, have you heard of Peter's theory of panpsychism?" The term panpsychism does ring a bell, but I'm not familiar with it. I don't know what that means. Forever Conscious Research Channel says, "Good afternoon, Jeremy. Hope you are having a good day. Enjoy your content." Oh, thank you. Yeah, I am having a pretty decent day. A little tired, but it's fine. I'm glad you enjoy the content. Amy K wrote, "I had the best lucid dream the other night because I was able to realize that I didn't know how I got to the room I was in. Thanks for the reminder to always question which level of reality we're on." Absolutely, that's amazing. So that is one very powerful dream sign. It's referred to in the community, in the lucid dreaming scientific community, you could say. Dream sign is essentially anything that is anomalous, and oftentimes some very powerful dream sign that I've experienced was not being able to remember the cause of the effect that I'm currently experiencing. So, like you said, you weren't sure how you got to the place you found yourself in. And you're like, wait a minute, how did I get here? And you try and remember backwards, and you're like, wait, there's no, I just showed up here, and then you realize, oh, it's a dream. Now, it's really interesting, and I think it's really funny how so often, especially when you are new to the lucid dreaming state, is that you will do some kind of state test, or you'll encounter dream sign, something anomalous, and it could be extremely anomalous, something that is, as far as you know, impossible to achieve in the waking state, like levitating off the ground, or I've done that before. I've thrown fireballs out of my hands, and manifested solid objects out of thin air, or different things like that. And was so convinced by the perception that I still thought that I was having a waking experience, even though such, anomalous events were happening. Somehow I just couldn't conceive of the possibility that what I was experiencing could be explained by this is a dream, I was so confident that I was having a waking experience. And a lot of people, I think most people have had that, where they've had a dream where they were just so convinced that it was waking reality that they couldn't even conceive of the possibility that they could be dreaming in that moment until they wake up and they're like, oh, that was a dream. And then they start to realize, that's when you start to realize, oh, I could be dreaming at any given moment, really. Like, how do I know? And there are ways you can test, but you have to be consciously testing, because if you're not questioning that, then you're not gonna recognize it. You're just going to assume that the reality you're being presented with, the experience you're being presented with, you're going to assume that it's a waking experience. It's just how we operate. And I think that's probably like a survival mechanism. But it's almost like we've got things backwards. We think the default for us for believing in something as reality is the waking experience, or sorry, the experience, the waking experience. We think everything is the waking experience. If we're presented with some experience, we just assume it's a waking experience. That's our default. We default down to that most dense level of reality. But the truest part of ourselves is perhaps the part that's still there when all of that experience crap is scraped away and we're just left with that pure point of awareness. So it's almost like we got it backwards. Okay, we got a couple more comments here. Panpsychism, basically, at my limited understanding, says that everything down to the fundamental particles of the cosmos has a level of awareness of some kind. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm gonna have to follow up on that for sure. So yeah, thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'll look into that because that's very intriguing. SK wrote, first time watching you live from Kenya. And also said fear pattern. Yeah, maybe that's why. Maybe it's based off of fear that we default to that level. Yeah, thanks for joining me, SK, on the live stream here. So another thing that I wanted to talk about here is immortality and how that relates to these three stages of consciousness, or three states of consciousness, I should say. And the idea is that, you know how earlier in the video I talked about how we could go from that single point of light, that formless, eternal point of pure awareness, and then we move into the higher level dimensions. Well, maybe this is part of the purpose of existence itself. We are like a god already, and we are exploring ourselves in a sense by expanding ourselves into these higher level dimensions. Like I said, the second dimension, the third dimension, the fourth dimension. Now, and then we forget ourselves in a sense because we get so wrapped up in that fourth dimension, that we get so caught up in it that we forget everything else. We just think that this is the only truth. Now, when we are alive, in the sense that our physical body is still operating, we have a vehicle for our conscious awareness to experience that fourth dimensional plane. That fourth dimensional, I guess it's more than a plane, but that fourth dimension. So the physical body is that vehicle for conscious awareness in the fourth dimension. Now, when that physical vehicle stops working, when it stops being a suitable vehicle for conscious awareness on the fourth dimension, we recede back to the third dimension. And here we're this is a sulfur plane, you could call it, if you're talking back to the alchemy terms. So we recede back to that. Now, in a lot of traditions, including both Gnosticism and a lot of the Eastern traditions, especially even the Tibetan tradition, they talk about once you're in there, you are experiencing kind of like a dreamlike state where there are swirlings of perception, energies that we are encountering and perceiving, and then we get caught up in them again. And that often this getting caught up into these energy patterns again leads us to spiral down into the fourth dimension again and get reborn. Usually we get drawn to the energies of people copulating, is what they say in the Eastern traditions, at least, that people having sex, the energies of that on the fourth dimension draw us in. And that we spiral in and get trapped, in a sense. Trapped, I mean, not necessarily trapped in the most negative view of it, but limited. Boxed in is a good term because it references like a cube, the cube of Saturn, the cube of limitation. We get caught into that conception, and then we build up another new fourth dimensional body, and the cycle begins again. And we have this cycle of rebirth, death and rebirth on the fourth dimensional plane. And we can take that back to, okay, well, what's happening on the third dimensional plane when we recede, when we don't have that fourth dimensional body, the vehicle anymore? Well, it can break down as well. And so what is that gets spiraled down into the fourth dimension again? It could be mulched. It could be decomposed soul matter. But what we want, especially on the left-hand path, is to forge such a powerful, unified vehicle on that sulfur level, on that, you could say, the third dimension, that it will not break down when the physical body dies, when the physical body stops being a proper vehicle for consciousness, and we recede back into that third dimensional vehicle. That third dimensional vehicle, if you examine it while you're alive, you'll realize that it's extremely fragmented. Our soul, let's call it the soul, we have a very fragmented soul. It's basically shattered into pieces, like a million pieces. And the bonds between them are loosely being held together. Now, supposedly, according to a lot of these traditions, when the fourth dimensional vehicle stops working, when we die, when our physical body dies, then the soul undergoes kind of a digestion as well. It gets fermented as well, just like the physical body undergoes. In alchemy, they call it putrefaction. It's the fermentation stage, in a sense. So the component, or the bonds between the different components of the physical body, start to weaken. The parts break down, and all the different parts end up going off and forming new bodies, not necessarily human, but like bugs and bacterial bodies, plant bodies, things like that. But physical bodies, the elements that your physical body was made of, get broken up and then reused, recycled to form new bodies. Now, as above, so below is a hermetic axiom that we can use to examine these things. Now, on the soul level, when the soul starts to encounter this death force, it starts to undergo putrefaction as well. So the bonds between the soul fragments start to break down as well. And these fragments, these chunks of soul that are within themselves relatively unified, but with each other are often at odds, and that's our internal conflicts. These soul fragments start to break apart, and it gets mulched down to its most primordial possible level, and then the soul parts end up getting redistributed and made into new souls. So what you want to do on the left-hand path is to take those fragments and forge them into a unified whole, so that it's all the different parts of the self, on the soul level, all the different parts of your soul are working. It's in such close union and harmony with one another that they essentially form a unified whole, so that it's not just individual fragments that are just kind of loosely held together, that it's actually a unified, you could say, crystalline structure. In a sense, you could say, you could take it's like taking pure carbon and just in a lump of coal, right? It's just incoherent, it's muddled, it's not aligned or anything like that. But if it gets put under enough pressure for a long enough period of time, it can actually form a crystalline structure and form a diamond, which is one of the hardest substances known to humanity. And so, as above, so below, let's put the soul in a crucible, an alchemical crucible, burn it in a sense, put it under pressure, have challenges, face challenges, delve into the damaged parts of the self, understand the source of that wound and heal it, and reintegrate those parts of yourself that you've denied, things like that. And eventually you can form the diamond body on the acausal plane, you could call it. And then the theory goes, when your physical body stops working, then you don't have that same vehicle in the fourth dimension for your conscious awareness. So it recedes back to the third dimension. Now, if you have developed that diamond body, it's not going to break down. Now you are in a position of power that you weren't in before. And if you can achieve a certain level of lucidity in that state, then your destiny is up to you. You can then choose to incarnate again on the fourth dimension. You can choose to incarnate. You can choose to you can choose to manifest a physical vehicle on the fourth dimension for your consciousness to act through, but it doesn't have to necessarily be through conception and building up a full organism like that. According to legend, at least, and according to occult science, you have what's called an ascended master, or a Taoist immortal, that sort of thing, where they are capable of spontaneously manifesting a vehicle for their conscious awareness on the physical plane at will, and then dissolving it when they don't need it anymore. So it's not, they don't have to go through that full cycle of death and rebirth, and they're not limited by the same limitations that normally you would be limited by on the fourth dimension, because they're in a superposition above it in a sense, or behind it, you know, in another sense. So that's kind of like really digging in, really in-depth digging into the whole idea of the different states of consciousness, why it's important to learn to be lucid in all three major phases, or all three major states of consciousness that are available to us, and how that translates into the great work of the left-hand path of achieving the state of actually becoming a force of nature, in a sense, in your own right, and solidifying that third dimensional vehicle for conscious awareness, and even expanding beyond that from a different perspective once you're there. So I think that it's almost like we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back in this whole cycle of manifestation, you could say. So I got a couple comments here. SK says, consciousness depends on harmonic vibrations of microtubules inside neurons, similar to certain kinds of Indian music, but unlike Western music, which is harmonic. And apparently that's a quote from Hammeroff. Okay. Adversarial Self says, my girlfriend and I were just talking about this topic of soul decomposition. Do you feel the archetypes of Carl Jung describes are the raw material of a diamond body, psychic ore? Yes, absolutely. Yes. This material, you could say, is what we use to forge the self from, and we pick up soul fragments from other people as well. They copy themselves onto us, and by communicating with one another, we copy our own soul fragments onto others as well. It's a type of software in a sense, right? Like I said, it's not limited by the same amount, or the same type of limitations that the fourth dimension has, with that linearity, where one moment is directly related to the moment that came before it. You have the ability to multiply things infinitely, so that's not a limitation on the third dimension, what you were talking about. So we can share soul fragments with one another, and actually, by listening to one of my videos, for example, you are receiving soul fragments from me, and which I've received from others, you know. And then you take all the different soul fragments that you've picked up along the way, you know, and if you have more of that, if you have a more rich experience of life, then you've got more ore to work with, more psychic ores to smelt and refine and forge a metallic, you know, structure that's a lot stronger than the ores that you had refined in the first place. So absolutely, that's a great insight, Adversarial Self. That's about it. I don't really have much time to keep going on this, but I really appreciate the input that you guys gave on this live stream. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I tried to do this as a pre-recorded video about like 4 times, and it always just devolved into like a rant. So I figured doing this topic in a live stream, it's more of a rant format anyways, so and I could get a bit of feedback from people and play off of that. So I think this was a success. It was really fun. Miss B says, thank you. you're welcome. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it. And if you like this video, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. If you think that one of your friends might enjoy this video or one of the other videos that I put out, please share it with them. YouTube has been deranking my stuff hardcore. Every single video I put out now gets demonetized, which means it doesn't get recommended nearly as much because YouTube isn't going to make a profit off of it, right? Sorry, Amy K says, thanks, Jeremy. You're very welcome. Lando Hoon, thank you, Jeremy. Adversarial Self, thank you for the shared time. Absolutely. Thank you guys for all being here, too. Bewitching Charm, wow, I made it. Just at the end, at least. But, yeah, thank you, everybody, for being part of this. And until next time, stay lucid. Now, how do I turn this off? Okay, here we go. See you guys. Stay lucid.